So hi guys, this is Ankesh Srivastav, uh, back with another video, and this video is gonna be about the situation of the world right now and where we are heading, including the analysis of US, China, Russia, India, um, South Africa, and Middle East, and the wars that are ongoing, including everything that matters for the world today and for the future of humanity. So this is gonna be long video, and we will talk about everything in depth, and we will just come to the conclusion later on that where we are heading and what is gonna be the future of humanity. Because as you know, the geopolitics trend is changing. The situation in which there was one superpower, that was US, is not the situation today, and the world is being divided into multipolar power structures. So here we go. So in this video we will be talking about uh, the world dividing into blocks again. So you can say Cold War 2.0, but it's gonna be multipolar. The Cold War 1 was between the US and the Russia and the Soviet Union. So we will cover US, Europe, Japan versus China, Russia, Iran axis, India balancing both, global south rising, and the key talking points will be NATO expansion, BRICS expansion, sanctions versus de-dollarization, trade corridors replacing alliances. Secondly, we will be talking about the map of future wars where conflicts are brewing. So the regions to cover are Taiwan Strait, US versus China flashpoint, Ukraine war spillover, Russia versus NATO proxy. Third is South China Sea militarization. The fourth is Israel Iran shadow war, India China border tensions, Red Sea shipping crisis, and the other topic we will be talking about is the currency war, death of the dollar. Is this the death of the dollar? So we will include BRICS currency discussions, oil trade in yuan, India buying Russian oil outside dollar system, and the sanctions weaponization. We will also talk about technology, Cold War, AI, chips, and cyber power. The key battlefields are US versus China semiconductor war, Taiwan chip dependency, AI arms race, quantum computing race, cyber warfare infrastructure attacks. The players are Nvidia, TSMC, and Huawei bans, India semiconductor mission. Guys, please ignore the video quality because right now I don't have a option to make the video on phone, because uh, I just wanted to make sure we have good quality audio in the video, because in the earlier videos I was just saying things and the voice was not proper. So I don't have a connector that connects my headphones with the phone. So this is because it's a, USB uh, adapter, which gets inserted into the PC only. So that's it. Alright, so the fifth is gonna be the energy in the new oil weapon, Middle East plus Russia plus US angle. We will cover Russia gas leverage over Europe, OPEC plus production cuts, Saudi pivot toward China, and India energy diplomacy, green energy race versus fossil power. We will also be talking about Middle East reset, the new alliances which are forming. So we will include Iran Saudi reapproachment, China brokered, Abraham Accords expansion, Israel Hamas war impact, Red Sea shipping attacks, Turkey's new Ottoman posture, and the another topic which we will be talking about will be China's grand strategy, Belt and Road to military bases. This is gonna be very important. We will cover debt diplomacy, string of pearls, Indian Ocean bases, Africa influence, Latin America entry, Taiwan timeline. Then we will talk about, is World War III structurally possible? So we will analyze alliance structures, nuclear deterrence, proxy wars and direct wars, economic interdependence, and AI warfare lowering war threshold. Then we will see uh, what is the angle of India here, the swing civilization. So we will see the India's rising geopolitical leverage. We will cover balancing US and Russia because both are important for the survival of India in the geopolitical map. Quad versus BRICS membership, global South leadership, manufacturing shift from China to India, defense self-reliance, and finally we will be talking about the end of the globalization, rise of strategic decoupling. So the topics will be supply chain shifting from China to India, Vietnam, or Mexico, and trade blocs replacing global trade, economic nationalism, and tech protectionism. Mm, we will be also talking about the new world order map, like 2035 projection. We will forecast about superpowers, regional powers, failing states, resource hubs, tech capitals, and lastly, space geopolitics, the next battlefield, the emerging frontier. So we will cover US Space Force, China Moon base plans, satellite warfare, Starlink in wars, anti-satellite weapons. So, um, all right. So let's go ahead with the part one. That is the end of the world, the end of the old world order. Um, the world you were born into no longer exists. The alliances that kept peace are fracturing. The economies that built prosperity are decoupling. The superpower that defined the global order is being challenged. We are not living in ordinary times. We are living through a structural transition from a unipolar world to a multipolar civilization system. This is the story of how transformation began, and who is driving it, and what it means for the future of humanity. So the unipolar movement, when America stood alone. To understand the future, we must return to 1991, the year the Soviet Union collapsed. For nearly a half century before that, the world was divided into two ideological and military camps. The first one was United States, uh, which was the capitalist liberal order, and the second one is uh, Soviet Union, the communist the command order. This bipolar structure defined geopolitics from 1945 to 1991. So every war, every alliance, every coup, every proxy conflict was filtered through this US USSR rivalry. But when the Soviet Union dissolved, something unprecedented happened in human history. For the first time, one power stood without a peer competitor, and that was United States. The United States became the largest economy, the strongest military, the dominant technological power, the issuer of the global reserve currency, the architect of global institutions, and this period became known as the unipolar movement. So, no empire in modern history had exercised such comprehensive influence across military, economic, financial, and cultural domains simultaneously. So, let's talk about the architecture of the US led global order. So, America did not dominate through conquest alone, it built systems, institutions that embedded its power structurally into the world. Key pillars included are financial institutions such as IMF, the World Bank. These control development financing and crisis bailouts. The second one is trade architecture, which was governed through WTO, World Trade Organization, and the Global Free Trade Agreements. So these institutionalized globalization under US friendly rules. And the third one is military alliances, NATO in Europe, bilateral defense treaties in Asia. These extended US security guarantees across continents. The currency power. The US dollar became the world's reserve currency. Oil, trade, debt, and global finance were do- uh, uh, denominated in dollars. This gave the US extraordinary leverage. It could sanction nations, freeze reserves, restrict financial access. No empire before controlled the monetary bloodstream of the planet like this. Let's talk about the globalization, the golden age from 1990 to 2010. With no rival superpower, globalization accelerated. Trade barriers fell, supply chains stretched across continents, manufacturing moved to low-cost regions, capital flowed freely. The logic was simple. West is about consumption plus finance. Asia is for manufacturing. The Middle East was only for energy. The global south for resources plus labor. This created the most economically integrated world in human history. Poverty fell globally. China industrialized at record speed. Europe unified economically. Technology spread rapidly. For a time, it appeared history has reached stability. Some scholars even called it the end of history. They believed liberal democracy plus free markets had permanently won. But beneath this stability, structural tensions were quietly forming. The rise of China inside the American system. No country benefited more from globalization than China. When China joined the WTA in 2001, it entered the global trade system fully. Western corporations moved manufacturing there. Cheap labor plus infrastructure plus state planning created an export juggernaut. Within decades, China became the world's factory, the largest exporter, a technological competitor, the second largest economy. But here lay the paradox. The US had integrated China economically without integrating it politically. China did not liberalize politically as expected. Instead, it used globalization to acquire uh, capital, acquire technology, build industrial dominance, modernize its military. In geopolitical theory, this is called a rising power inside an existing hegemonic system. Historically, such dynamics create structural rivalry. NATO expansion, Russia's strategic humiliation. While China rose economically, Russia experienced the opposite trajectory. After the Soviet collapse, its economy shrank dramatically, military power weakened, political instability rose. Meanwhile, NATO, originally formed to counter the USSR, did not dissolve. Instead, it expanded eastward. Former Soviet bloc nations joined NATO: Poland, Hungary, Baltic states, Romania, others. From Russia's perspective, this was not defensive expansion, it was strategic encroachment towards its borders. Russian leadership repeatedly warned that Ukraine joining NATO would cross a red line. This unresolved tension would later erupt into a open war. The 2008 financial crisis was the crack in the system. If 1991 marked the birth of US unipolarity, 2008 marked the beginning of its structural questioning. The global financial crisis originated in the US housing market, but its effects were global. Key consequences: the Western banking credibility collapsed, global recession spread, Trust in US financial stewardship declined. Meanwhile, China weathered the crisis better through state intervention. This created a psychological shift. The Western liberal financial model no longer appeared invincible. Emerging powers began exploring alternatives. The weaponization in weaponization of interdependence. As geopolitical rivalry returned, economic tools became weapons. The sanctions emerged as a primary instrument of coercion. The US could cut nations from swift banking, freeze foreign reserves, block trade financing. Sanctions were used against Iran, Russia, Venezuela, and others, but this had unintended consequences. Targeted nations began building alternative systems, non-dollar trade, parallel payment networks, gold reserve accumulation. This marked the early stages of de-dollarization effects. The return of the great power competition. By the 2010s, three realities were evident. China had risen to peer economic status. Russia had militarily reasserted itself. US global dominance was being contested regionally. The unipolar movement was ending. Strategists began using a new phase again, great power competition. The world was no longer organized around terrorism or rogue states, but around major civilization scale powers competing structurally. COVID 19 accelerator of decoupling. The pandemic exposed vulnerabilities in hyperglobalization, supply chain dependence on China, medical manufacturing concentration, semiconductor shortages. Nations realized economic interdependence could become strategic vulnerability. This triggered supply chain reshoring, China plus one manufacturing strategies, industrial policy revival. Sorry, globalization did not end, but it began fragmenting. The world at the edge of reordering. By the early 2020s, multiple structural pressures converged. US-China rivalry intensified. Russia-NATO conflict erupted in Ukraine. Middle East realignments began. BRICS expanded influence. Technology wars accelerated. Energy geopolitics weaponized. The system built after 1991 was no longer stable. We entered a transitional era, not chaos, but reorganization. The old order is not collapsing overnight. It is being renegotiated treaty by treaty, war by war, alliance by alliance. New power centers are rising, old powers are adapting. Swing civilizations are hedging. To understand the future, we must now map the emerging blocks shaping it. So the next part is power blocks forming the new geopolitical map. We will dive into US alliance system, China's sphere of influence, Russia strategic depth, India balancing strategy, Middle East hedging, and global south alignment shifts. So the post Cold War world was organized around one center of gravity, the United States. But as power diffused economically, militarily, and technologically, the world did not descend into disorder. It began reorganizing into blocks, not rigid like Cold War, but fluid, overlapping, and strategically hedged. This is emerging geopolitical map of the 21st century. So, what is a power block? A power block is not just a military alliance. It is a layered system of alignment including defense partnerships, trade integration, technology sharing, energy dependency, financial systems, diplomatic coordination. In the modern era, blocks are less ideological and more interest driven. Nations align based on security needs, economic leverage, resource access, civilizational affinity, and regime survival. This makes today's blocs more complex than the US USSR binary. The US led alliance system. Despite talks of decline, the US still commands the most extensive alliance network in human history. This bloc spans three major theaters: Europe, the NATO core. NATO remains the backbone of the US hard power projection. Key features are collective defense under Article 5, integrated command structures, US nuclear umbrella, forward troop deployments. Since the Ukraine war, NATO cohesion has strengthened rather than weakened. Defense spending has increased across Europe. Finland joined NATO. Sweden moved toward accession. Eastern Europe has militarized rapidly. From Washington's perspective, NATO expansion locks Europe structurally into the US security architecture. The Asia Pacific allies. To counterbalance China, the US relies on maritime alliance chains. Japan for technological plus naval support, South Korea as a military plus industrial partner, and Australia as a strategic Pacific anchor. Additional frameworks include AUKUS, AUKUS, that is a nuclear submarine sharing uh, initiative, the Quad coordination, the bilateral defense treaties. This alliance arc forms a containment perimeter around China's eastern seaboard. The global military footprint. The US maintains hundreds of overseas bases. This provides rapid deployment capability, supply chain logistics, surveillance reach, nuclear deterrence positioning. No other power possesses comparable expeditionary infrastructure. China's emerging sphere of influence. Unlike the US, China's bloc is not primarily military yet. It is infrastructural, economic, and developmental. The core instrument is the Belt and Road Initiative. Through BRI, China finances and builds ports, railways, highways, energy pipelines, digital infrastructure. Participating regions include Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, Middle East, Eastern Europe, Latin America. This creates long-term dependency through debt financing, trade corridors, strategic port access. Critics call it debt diplomacy. China frames it as development partnership, but both contain elements of truth. Strategic outcomes. China's economic bloc yields geopolitical leverage, port access for naval logistics, political influence in UN voting, resource supply security, trade route redundancy. Over time, economic dependence can translate into diplomatic alignment. The Russia strategic axis. Russia's bloc is narrower but militarily significant. It relies on three pillars: post-Soviet security depth. Russia maintains influence across former Soviet space, Belarus, military integration, Central Asia for security partnerships, Caucasus leverage. This acts as a geographic buffer zone. Energy dependency networks. So, Russia has historically used energy exports as geopolitical leverage. Pipeline diplomacy tied Europe to Russian gas for decades. Even under sanctions, Russia has redirected energy flows toward China, India, Turkey, global south buyers. Energy remains Moscow's primary structural influence tool. Military export relationships. Russia supplies arms globally. India, a historical uh, major buyer. Middle East states, and African governments. This creates defense dependency and training relationships. The non aligned swing powers. Perhaps the most important feature of the emerging order is not the blocs themselves, but the nations refusing to fully join them. These are swing civilizations, states maximizing leverage by engaging multiple poles simultaneously. India as a strategic balancer. India participates in Quad with US, Japan, and Australia, in BRICS with China and Russia, SCO security forums as well. So it buys Russian oil while deepening US tech ties. It joins Western supply chains while resisting alliance entrapment. India's doctrine is strategic autonomy. It does not seek bloc subordination, it seeks civilizational elevation. Saudi Arabia, energy swing power. Saudi Arabia historically aligned with the US security system, but recent shifts include oil pricing coordination with Russia, diplomatic engagement with China, BRICS dialogue participation. Riyadh is diversifying partnerships to hedge against US unpredictability. Turkey, geopolitical hedger. Turkey is a NATO member but yet pursues independent regional strategy. Examples include defense purchases from Russia, operations in Syria, Mediterranean energy disputes, pan Turkic influence expansion. Turkey balances between West and East for regional leverage. Brazil and Global South leaders. Latin American and African powers increasingly resist binary alignment. They seek investment from China, security ties with US, trade diversification, currency alternatives. This creates a full fluid diplomatic environment. Europe, an ally or independent pole. Mm, Europe remains aligned with the US militarily, but economically and politically tensions exist. Key structural dilemmas: energy dependence versus Russia sanctions, trade exposure to China, desire for strategic autonomy, defense reliance on US umbrella. France and Germany periodically advocate independent European defense identity, but Ukraine war realities have reinforced US reliance. Europe today is allied but strategically anxious. Let's talk about Middle East, from chaos to multi-alignment. Historically dominated by US intervention, the Middle East is now diversifying alignments. Shifts include China brokering Iran Saudi reapproachment, Gulf states joining BRICS dialogues, Israel expanding regional normalization, Turkey projecting independent power. External great powers now compete diplomatically rather than intervene unilaterally. This marks maturation of regional agency. Now Africa, the competition frontier. Africa is becoming a geopolitical investment battleground. Uh, Competing actors include China, infrastructure plus loans, US security plus governance programs, Russia security contractors plus arms, and Europe for development plus trade. Africa's demographics, resources, and urbanization makes it a future power center, not just a peripheral theater. Structure of a multipolar system. Unlike Cold War bipolarity, today's system has characteristics: um, overlapping alliances, issue based cooperation, economic interdependence across rival blocs, strategic hedging by mid powers. This creates instability but also reduces rigid confrontation risk. It is a competitive coexistence. So the world is no longer organized around one capital, nor divided cleanly into two camps. It is reorganizing into layered spheres of influence: military, economic, technological, and civilizational. Some nations lead blocs, others hedge between them, and a few will determine the balance of the entire system. But blocs alone do not define geopolitics, conflict lines do. To understand where the world may fracture, we must now examine the active and emerging war zones shaping the global future. So, in the part 3, we will be talking about active and future war zones, mapping global conflict. So, we will deep cover Ukraine war system impact, Taiwan flashpoint, South China Sea militarization, India China border, Middle East proxy wars, Red Sea crisis, Korean Peninsula, and future resource wars. So, now coming to the part 3, mapping the fault lines of the global conflict. Power blocks define influence, but wars define transformation. Every world order in history has been reshaped not just by diplomacy but by conflict. Some wars redraw borders, others redraw alliances, and a few redraw the structure of the entire international system. Today, multiple conflict zones, active and emerging, are performing an interconnected map of global tension. To understand the future, we must map these fault lines. The first is Ukraine war, the return of the industrial warfare. The Russia Ukraine war is the largest land war in Europe since World War II, but its significance extends far beyond territorial dispute. It is a structural confrontation between Russia's demand for strategic buffer space and NATO's eastward expansion model. From Moscow's perspective, Ukraine joining Western military structures was an existential threat. From NATO's perspective, Ukraine had sovereign right to align freely. This e, uh, this security dilemma culminated in war. System consequences. The conflict triggered cascading geopolitical shifts. NATO militarization, which uh, includes defense budgets surged, Eastern Europe fortified, US troop deployments expanded. Second is economic warfare. Russia sanctioned heavily, foreign reserves frozen, energy trade weaponized. And the third is energy realignment. Europe cut Russian gas, LNG imports rose, energy prices spiked globally. Military lessons. The war revealed the return of trench warfare, artillery dominance, drone reconnaissance, and satellite targeting, and lastly, electronic warfare. Modern war became a fusion of World War I attrition plus AI surveillance. Taiwan Strait, the most dangerous flashpoint. If Ukraine represents land war revival, Taiwan represents great power naval confrontation risk. China views Taiwan as a breakaway province. The United States views Taiwan as a strategic democratic partner and semiconductor hub. Now, uh, why Taiwan matters globally? Taiwan produces a majority of the world's advanced semiconductors. These chips power smartphones, AI systems, military platforms, global computing infrastructure. A conflict would disrupt global technology supply chains overnight. Military dynamics. China has increased airspace incursions, naval patrols, amphibious assault drills, missile deployments. The US has responded with naval transits, arms sales, regional alliance strengthening. This creates a classic uh, trap scenario. Rising powers challenging status quo maritime hegemon. So let's talk about South China Sea maritime choke point contest. This region handles roughly one third of the global maritime trade. China claims large portions via the 9 dash line. Competing claimants include Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei. China has constructed artificial islands equipped with airstrips, missile systems, radar installations. The US conducts freedom of navigation patrols to challenge these claims. Strategic importance. Control over this sea lane impacts energy shipments, trade logistics, naval projection capability. It is less likely to erupt into full war, but high risk for naval skirmishes and escalation incidents. Fourth, India China border, Himalayan tension zone. The line of the actual control remains disputed. Clashes in recent years, including Galwan Valley, marked the deadliest confrontation in decades. Key drivers include territorial ambiguity, infrastructure buildup, strategic road networks, surveillance, deployment. Strategic significance. This conflict is unique. Two nuclear powers, high altitude warfare, limited but volatile engagements. India has since militarized uh, border infrastructure, restricted Chinese investments, strengthened Quad participation. The border remains a simmering flashpoint, unlikely to escalate into full war but structurally unresolved. Middle East, a proxy war complex. Unlike state to state wars, the Middle East operates through proxy conflict ecosystems. Key rivalries include Iran versus Israel, Iran versus Saudi Arabia historically, Sunni versus Shia influence arcs. Iran supports non state actors including Hezbollah, various militaries, and regional armed networks. Israel conducts airstrikes on Iranian assets, covert operations, intelligence warfare. This creates persistent shadow conflict without formal war declarations. Now let's talk about Red Sea and shipping warfare. Recent attacks on commercial shipping have highlighted maritime vulnerability. Strategic implications include insurance cost spikes, trade rerouting, naval escorts deployment. Choke points like Bab el Mandeb, Suez Canal approaches are critical to global trade continuity. Even localized disruptions create global supply shocks. Korean Peninsula, a nuclear standoff. North Korea remains one of the most militarized states. Capabilities include nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, submarine launch systems. South Korea, South Korea and Japan rely heavily on US extended deterrence. Periodic missile tests and military exercises maintain escalation risk, while full war is unlikely due to nuclear deterrence. Miscalculation remains a persistent threat. Warfare, uh, an invisible battlefield. Modern conflict increasingly occurs below kinetic thresholds. Cyber operations target power grids, financial systems, telecommunications, military command networks. Major powers maintain offensive cyber capabilities. These attacks offer plausible deniability, making retaliation complex. Space, the new strategic domain. Satellites enable GPS navigation, military targeting, communication systems, missile warning detection. Anti satellites weapon tested by multiple powers risk creating orbital debris fields. Future wars may begin with satellite blindness rather than missile strikes. Resource and climate conflict, future war drivers. Beyond traditional wars, future conflicts drivers include water scarcity, Nile Basin uh, tensions, Indus water disputes, and Central Asian river conflicts. The Arctic competition, melting ice opens new shipping lanes and resource extraction zones. Rare earth control, critical for electronics, military systems, renewable infrastructure. Here, China dominates processing capacity. So, the structural pattern is across all these zones, common patterns emerge. Nuclear deterrence prevents direct great power war. Proxy conflicts absorb rivalry pressures. Economic warfare accompanies military tension, and technology amplifies battlefield transparency. This creates a world of constant friction but managed escalation. The map of conflict today is not defined by one war but by a network of interconnected flashpoints. Some are active battlefields, others are dormant volcanoes, yet behind every missile launch, every naval patrol, every border clash lies a deeper driver. Economics, trade, currency, financial power. To understand why wars are fought, we must now examine the economic battlefield shaping them. So, the next part is going to be the economic war, sanctions, trade, and currency power. We will cover sanctions as geopolitical weapons, dollar dominance, BRICS expansion, de dollarization, trade corridor wars, supply chain decoupling. So, wars are no longer fought only with tanks and missiles. They are fought through currencies, banking system, trade routes, and financial isolation. In the 21st century, economic warfare has become the primary instrument of geopolitical coercion. Nations are no longer conquered by armies alone, they can be paralyzed through financial systems. This is the hidden war shaping the global order. From military dominance to financial dominance. After the Cold War, the United States did not rely solely on military supremacy, it leveraged control over global finance. This control rested on three structural pillars: the US dollar, global reserve currency. The US dollar became the backbone of the international trade. Key dynamics: oil priced in dollars, global trade settled in dollars, central banks held dollar reserves, international debt issued in dollars. So, this created structural dependency. If nations wanted to trade globally, they needed dollar access. The financial nervous system, SWIFT. SWIFT is messaging network enabling international banking transactions. While headquartered in Europe, it operates under Western regulatory influence. Being cut from SWIFT severely restricts a nation's ability to conduct global trade. It is effectively financial isolation. US Treasury and sanctions mechanism. Through control over dollar clearing systems, the US Treasury can freeze foreign reserves, block transactions, penalize banks, restrict sovereign financing. This weaponization of financial infrastructure is unprecedented in history. Sanctions as geopolitical warfare. So, sanctions have become the first line of coercion before military action. Major targets have included Russia, Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. So, let's have a case study of Iran. Sanctions on Iran targeted oil exports, banking access, currency stability. Economic consequences included inflation spikes, currency collapse, trade restrictions. Yet Iran adapted by building smuggling networks, non-dollar trade channels, regional barter systems. Sanctions inflicted pain but did not collapse the regime. Now let's have a case study on Russia. After the Ukraine invasion, Russia faced one of the largest sanction regimes in modern history. The measures included freezing foreign reserves, energy import bans, technology export restrictions, banking isolation. However, Russia mitigated impact through um, energy exports to Asia, ruble stabilization measures, global reserves, and alternative payment systems. This demonstrated a critical lesson. Sanctions are powerful but not absolute. Now, let's come to the third part, that is the freezing of foreign reserves, a turning point.